Hello, Dr. Mantz.
Hey Jim, how are you today?
I'm very good, very good. So it's April 14th here in Australia. And
hmm
believe it or not, it's been almost a month of this crazy self-isolation quarantine. Feels like 10 years, but it's been a month. And
Yeah,
we're
it's been a
still,
radical new social experiment that I think we've all unwillingly are taking part of. So it's an interesting
yeah,
time
and
period.
we're hanging in there. Looks to be at least some good news in some places with the curve flattening and
hmm
signs that we could start as a society taking some steps towards normal.
hmm
Hopefully, that'll come and won't be too much of a problem for us. And I guess the other thing is, even when things go back to normal, they're not going to be normal, right? So there's going to be all of the other problems from the pandemic, the shattered economy, general mental health, and unemployment, these types of things. So yeah, we're hanging in there. So today, some questions for you cover some of these like aspirations versus bad habits, and maybe also how to deal with loss of various kinds. So to kick it out, kick it off, let's talk about basically the health part of things. So you've given us a lot of advice around, getting reliable, good sleep, avoiding alcohol, avoiding sugar and refined foods, making sure we exercise, different types of supplements we could take, just like things that we could do to stay healthy. And I think we all really try our hardest to do those things the best we can. But on the other hand, our aspirations sometimes just hit bad habits, and it's like hard to do these things. So personally, like I've noticed on the grocery runs, I send my wife out for tons of donuts, and I also end up drinking like 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day. This is a lot more than usual, so I'm like trying to deal with being shut in by just like amping up the sugar and caffeine.
hmm
So I think a question for you is, like, how do we deal with this? Like, we sort of have these aspirations maybe not to do these things that in the end are like harmful longer term, but in the short
hmm
term they feel good.
Sure.
What are your tips for like just managing staying away from the like bad habits or like things we just do in self isolation, to try to deal with it?
Yeah, it's definitely an important question. So first of all, what I like to try to do because is to change the idea of using the words good and bad. And it's very critical because oftentimes a lot of us, what I've noticed when I'm working with a lot of my patients is people feeling like there's a tendency to feel guilt and or shame, especially as we're isolating. Those are common feelings to have because those are our social emotions. Those are the ones that develop through our social engagements. And when things are rough and when things are tough and we're isolating ourselves, there's this propensity to feel more guilt and shame. And I've seen it in a lot of my clients and working on that. So one of the things we do is be careful with the words that we use. And it may seem almost nitpicky, but it's important. So when we look at things as bad, it has a moralistic quality. And it's often like, and then you feel like kind of guilty afterwards. Maybe you have your donuts and then you feel like, then not only you maybe felt good in the moment when you're eating it and you get that self-soothing, then how do you feel an hour after those donuts? How did you feel 2 hours after those donuts? So the idea is not to create kind of a rule, because if you start working on what we call rule governed behavior, it's inflexible and generally we don't follow it. Kind of like a little bit of an adjacent thing is that most portion controlled diets, for instance, 98% failure rate after about 2 years. Mostly people return back to their normal or even gain more because it's not adaptive. So what we want to do is just be able to start to educate ourselves on how it feels. So oftentimes when you having those donuts, I would say like, don't stop eating it. All right, well, what do you feel like an hour afterwards? What do you feel like 2 hours afterwards? And that kind of thing. Just start highlighting in your own brain the after effects, the consequences of that. And how do you feel? Do you feel strong? Do you feel healthy? Do you feel like you want to take on more? Or, do you experience these sort of more unhealthier kind of states and that kind of thing? And the more you bring your mind with that and be conscious of it, you don't have to whip yourself. It'll actually naturally your brain will start to piece it together and you'll start to naturally make better choices, healthier choices overall.
Yeah, that's really good. I've noticed with the sugar high later in the day, I just have this awful like, I don't know, like a feeling like I ate just too much sugar and I like regret it. So maybe spending
hmm
some more time on that. wonder if there's also, like you mentioned, guilt. I see a lot of people, and I put myself in this bucket too. There's some guilt around productivity.
Mhm.
We're home. It feels like we should have a lot of time for projects.
Mm.
Maybe there's also conflicts between the amount of work we can do for home if we have that type of job, and then also duties with kids, or just keeping the house clean and dealing with a partner.
Mhm.
Um, what do you have? Do you have any tips for like guilt around this feeling like we should be more productive during this time?
Yeah, and that is when if you're feeling like the guilt, and sometimes guilt and anxiety are kind of very similar to each other. And oftentimes, like when we feel guilt, what's a helpful thing to understand is that you wouldn't feel guilt unless some part of you cared. So what I generally recommend when people are working with guilt in different situations, what you want to do is like, all right, you wouldn't feel guilty if you didn't give a shit. So the reason why you do feel guilty, because there's something that you do care about, and yet there's an action or something that you're doing or not doing that maybe kind of missing the mark on what you value. So what you would want to first do is find out like what it is that you really want, you find meaning in. What do you value? And you could just start off with just a couple things that generally you just think back in your mind. What are the things when you engage in certain activities, sort of like you lose a sense of time when you're doing it, where you feel like a sense of vitality, even a little bit rising in the body, where instead of like you're feeling this sort of slumber state where you're just sort of collapsing within yourself, you can start to notice you're starting to be more upright. You feel more bright. You notice a little bit of energy. So I'm always bringing my clients' attention back into their body and sensing it, because our minds right now, if you haven't noticed, they can be a little bit unreliable, but the body itself is a little bit more reliable in what it's sensing and the sensation. So you use that. So when you're feeling tight or constricted, then you can kind of cue that in. Okay, what's going on right now that may be kind of throwing me a little bit off balance, and then coming up with some ideas that might be a better way to adjust that. And then that way that will help guide you. What I guide for my patients, I call it the sensational navigation system, and it's something that you have to develop over time with certain practices, but you can still check in, and it can kind of give you like when you're feeling a sense of unease. I'll give you an example. It happened yesterday. We were at Easter, and we were like, my wife and I were just sort of sitting there, and oftentimes it's a time for family and celebration and feeling that connection, and you could feel the palpable emptiness quality, and we're just sitting there. And as you were kind of mentioning, we kind of left our apartment, and we kept it reasonably, but we hadn't done that like deep cleaning in a long time, and we're just sitting there and just kind of just moping around, and just feeling kind of just crappy, to be quite honest with you. And then eventually we just, what, let's just start cleaning. And let's just start organizing the thing. And I can tell you the difference that we felt afterwards. It's like you have to get that engine running. But once you get the engine running, you put on some good music, you kind of do that and clean up the whole thing. Really like helped kind of put things in perspective. And then we allowed ourselves, as we started to feel like our state change, because when you're in that low state, you don't want to think about planning at that point, because you're just going to look like it's all going to look dark at that. When you're feeling like crap, everything just looks bleak, dark. So I always recommend, if you're in those darker states, it's better not to use your mind for future planning. Wait till it rises and then use your mind. And then we were able to think of, well, we had some structure, but then we realized we needed to actually adapt that and make more structure for us to like meet up at certain times. For us, we're meeting up at 11 o'clock every day from 11 to 12 to kind of discuss things, to be like that way. Spend some time at night. We actually found out for ourselves, and, so I'm giving you just concrete examples in which people can work off of. But rather than waiting and either watching TV or something along those lines, I tend to go to bed around 11. So we spend this sort of that kind of twilight hours, like the hour before, just kind of spending time together, just like laying in bed, just talking and those kind of more quiet, peaceful moments. So you can do these little things and add them in little by little. Experiment. Just try and experiment and use play to help guide you, as opposed to the kind of the bullwhip. The bullwhip will generally not work in these cases.
Yeah, I think the productivity thing, once you get started, you can feel really good about it. Like I also was cleaning the other day and like really got in the groove of that. And my wife's like, "Oh my God, anything's possible." I think she was really surprised. So
Yeah.
and maybe like the harder part of the productivity, at least for me, is when I feel conflicted sometimes between doing two things or like having to balance things at once. Like, um, I am able to do some work from home, but at the
Mhm,
same time, my kids need attention. And there's
mhm,
always like a struggle of like, well, I'm on a computer for a long period of time and the kids have nothing to do. And I sort of feel this like pull of, I'm damned if I do or damned if I don't
mhm.
here. Um, are there and I'll also like relate it back to the body. Like I could feel this like agitation, like just go away, kids. Like I have to
Yeah,
do this inside.
yeah,
Like, and
yeah.
it's not like a more like healthy, like, oh, I know, like I'm gonna give my kids something to do, and like that'll be fine for an hour, and then I'll take a break. It's just totally I'm in this agitation zone.
Yeah.
So how do I
So
get out of that?
well,
Where's the magic?
there's some healthy ways out of that, and there's some unhealthy ways out of that. So we'll focus on some of that. The first thing, obviously, is as you're kind of noticing, you're telling me about a particular pattern that you're noticing. It's not like a one-time occurrence. So whenever that's happening, is to kind of look at, okay, that's going to happen some more. The likelihood that's going to continue to happen. So how do I create boundaries for myself, and also with my children, and with my, if you're with your spouse or whoever, like your particular living situation with. And again, it comes back to what we sort of were talking about before, and that is when things are calm, when things are kind of relaxed, is that you guys kind of talk about the different patterns that you're having and sharing with that. And then depending upon the age of the children that you're working with, also talking about that at an age appropriate level. What the different challenges and struggles, because they're going through challenges and struggles too. I mean, oftentimes, kids, it was like a punishment to kind of keep them indoors all the time. And now they're kind of like indoors all the time, and like, not getting an opportunity to go out and play. And there's this absolutely natural need to kind of do that kind of play outside, mixing with other people, socializing, and they're not getting that too. So they too have their own issues. So it's like there could be an opportunity to, share with one another, be able to, in those experiences, and being able to understand, be able to keep some boundaries so that you can honor that part of you that wants to be productive, that wants to kind of, whether it's to develop certain new skills, whether it's to educate yourself, whether other kind of things, as you're, maybe changing jobs, or you're trying to do something else within your job that you have, or you don't have a job and you're trying to look for a new one. So there's a host of things that you may want to do there, or projects that you just started to get into, developing aspects of yourself. But dealing with that also with your kids, and also if you have any spouse that you deal with, where you can kind of one time give it, have the other person take over, and the other one take the other time over. And even asking your kids, again, age appropriately, whether like what things that they can do while you're doing that thing, and try to plan it out ahead. Now realize that that's not going to be like you do that once and that's going to work out. Obviously it's going to be a work in progress. And over time, though, that should help mitigate some of the agitation. But the agitation means something of value is being blocked. It's that
Yeah.
seeking system being blocked. And so that's a good indicator. That's something important to you, not something to suppress or get rid of, which is how people might do it with like booze or something along those lines, which, if you haven't noticed how much booze sales have risen, at least in the United States, it's gone up considerably. So
Yeah.
I guess no one's really listening to the lay off the booze. But yeah, the more you do it, but you have to learn the consequences of that and be able to do this,
Yeah.
just like you were talking about the donuts. Right?
Yeah, my girls are 8 and 5, so they're old enough um, for us to explain things to them, and so I think that's something really nice for us to try. Like we have family talks over dinner, occasionally, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe just sitting down and explaining, like, hey, like, Daddy has to work sometimes, and he's not always going to be available. 'Cause
Mm-hmm.
I don't want them to feel like they're being ignored, and I really appreciate the reminder that, yeah, the kids have to deal with this too, and they don't necessarily even have the understanding framework to really like get really the big picture of what's going on. This is a really
Exactly.
nice
And
one.
you can constantly ask them, like, if you are for instance, like you brought up, maybe I don't want them to feel like they're being ignored. And so you can even just bring that up, and then like let them talk about it, bring it up, because oftentimes you think they might be thinking that, they probably are. And so you might as well just flush it out and be able to talk about it right then and there. And I think that way everyone will feel good, because it's like a mix of like different forms of responsibility that are battling each other at that point. One of just wanting to be productive, and maybe, things about your own kind of career development, or just the development of just certain types of skills or potentials that you always wanted to, and also that of being a parent. And again, the more open and honest, the more it takes practice too. It's not like it's going to be great on the first time. Oftentimes it won't be, but over time that will pay off big time.
Yeah. And I think it also involves a partner as well.
Yeah.
Partner wants to do things and also develop and sort of managing this. So definitely important to talk it out. And I guess this is a good segue into next topic. And this is more of when things move from maybe stressful and having to balance and like kind of guilt over productivity into anticipated or actual loss.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us have either lost jobs or having a hard time finding employment. And then there's the aspect of the illness where there's the potential or actual loss of a loved one. And so I think just some general ideas about how to deal with loss, both actual and potential, that might be useful for people.
Sure. And this comes down to grief. I mean, that's the emotional synonymous with loss, and that is our willingness to be okay with it. And I think that's one of the things we struggle a lot in our culture. I think we mentioned this last time, and particularly past generations, and I still think in this generation too, we just have a deep uncomfortableness with grief. And so is allowing yourself to feel that grief, allowing you to let go of that, to process through that, because if that's held in, grief is when they look at MRI studies and they're looking at these kind of primary emotions, grief lights up the brain the most. More than any other emotion, grief lights up the brain. It's extraordinarily powerful. So any of our restrictions on that, if it's blocked to a certain degree, that will generally lend itself to a whole host of different possible problems, including addiction, isolation, depression, anxiety. I mean, you name it. Unprocessed grief can lead its way to it, and it's hard to then talk to it, and that could lead to kind of a mixture of both just sadness and or like anxiety, agitation, anger. It could lead to a whole host of things, because grief can almost encapsulate all those different emotions. So I think first is the willingness that if you had loss, is to let yourself acknowledge that it's something, that grief in itself is something, indicates something of deep meaning and value for you. And when you do grieve, after you've grieved, you can ask yourself, it's an opportunity to then say, what was it that was really meaningful for me in that particular moment? Because that will help you, after you've allowed yourself to grieve, to give you a clue, as to give you a guide, a compass that can help guide you to going after the grieving, after the loss, to go like, all right, where do I go from here? So I'll just tackle the first one, and that is obviously the job loss situation. And that is looking at the different types of skills that you may want to acquire, that are there. Like, first of all, you want to do an inventory of where you're at, and be an honest inventory. Again, when you're in a decent state, you don't want to do this in a negative state, because obviously you're going to be like, oh, I don't have this, I suck at this, or all that. That's not what you want. You want to look at, like, the skill sets that you have, the different resources that you have, the social connections that you may have, all those kind of things that that can help serve as a guide to what steps to take. And then to set up at that point, you can start to look at what skills that you would want to improve on. Perhaps maybe this is an opportunity. It's not just a thing where, like, maybe you kind of were in a kind of a not the best job in the world. It was kind of like you're getting more burnt out and miserable. And at first, a lot of us maybe felt joy from having that separation, but now maybe having lost it, you're like, oh crap, what do I do? And that sense of insecurity. So being able to follow through, like, well, what is it that I really find meaning in? And where can I develop the skills that I want to where I can guide that into a possible vocation? And then you have to balance that out, obviously, with your financial obligations. So maybe if there is another job that you would have to take for a while, though, in those moments, until you get that other job, you can still figure out a game plan. Maybe you have to take something that's not quite as meaningful to kind of handle your financial responsibilities. I mean, that's still there. So you do that, and you put on maybe the skills and the education and the people that can help you, people that you can model, people that can help you mentor. There's a lot of people wanting to help right now who are in better positions in this case, and then there's this reaching out. So there is this component. So by lining those up, and like I said, you can just take it one step at a time. As your body gets better at doing these things, then you can add on more so you don't overwhelm yourself. Sometimes people will overdo it. And of course, then they set themselves up for a kind of a failure feeling, as opposed to just setting it up. If it's in alignment with your value, you will feel it. It will have a certain vitality inside. It's a little bit of a uprise in the body, and that will help chart your course. And little by little, you'd be surprising how far it can take you. And like I said, balancing out those two things of one, your financial responsibilities, and also the responsibilities you have for yourself to pursue meaning in your life.
Yeah, and I think here there's a bit of the dark cloud of the pandemic to navigate. And so you mentioned looking at it as an opportunity versus seeing like, whoa, oh no, like I'm never going to be able to get a job now, and the economy's really messed up forever. Do you have any tips for like staying on the positive side of that coin and not going into like the fears about the situation when it comes to finding a new job or dealing with some sort of employment issue?
Yeah. So you gave a great example of what happened. So I want to give this general pattern that I've noticed in a lot of us. It may sound like a weird thing to ask, but when you're in a particular situation and maybe you're in an uneasy situation, it's maybe sound like you close your eyes and you can ask, how old do I feel right now? And sometimes you might be surprised if you allow that answer to come up. You may be surprised that a younger part of you has arisen in those kind of. So oftentimes what we see when we're in chronic levels of stress and isolation I like to think of our mind as having a bunch of different kind of programs, and different programs come to the surface. Like basically, for instance, like the part of me that's coming right now as we do this talk is not the same part of me that I'm with my wife. There's a subtle, shift in the way my particular programming is happening right now based on the context or the environment. In this situation, talking to you, as opposed to with my wife, as opposed to when I'm with my friends or with my parents. Different programs are called forth and you act like that. And oftentimes you'll notice this mainly also with our parents, is that we tend to kind of get into these regressed states. We'll feel like as if you're 12 years old and all these kind of things. So this regression can often happen, and you start to notice, so why am I bringing that up? You brought up a couple words in that earlier statement. You said never, and you also said forever. Things are never going to get better. It's always going to be this way. So never, always, forever. These sort of extreme absolute terms. These are the terms of a younger regressed mind. There's a lack of discernment. There's a lack of, it's an all or nothing phenomena. So you want to keep track of that when you're thinking in these sort of binary all or nothing terms and a sort of absolute like never, always. Well, could you predict what had just happened about a month ago? Most people could not do that. So how the hell could you predict that it's always going to be like this? How are you so assured with your brain right now that it's going to actually predict with this great accuracy and that it's never going to get better, considering how complex it is? In some instance, I don't want to put this, but it's almost a sort of arrogance in the mind that we could actually predict this complex situation in that sense. And in that sense, when you want to be careful of the words that you're choosing, because as you're noticing that, you can tell where you might be in that particular state. And if you're in that more kind of regress state, then it's probably better to kind of do something playful, open up the air a little bit before you start to kind of pursue these kind of things and how things are going to be overall. So I wanted to start first and foremost on that, and then we can kind of dive into the very specific areas that you wanted to go into. So you were meaning in general other parts of loss?
Yeah, so there's job, and then there are also parts of loss that have to do with the illness itself. So, what if a very close loved one or someone in the family gets COVID?
Mm-hmm.
There's the sort of fear of what could happen. There could just be, long-term recovery even for someone who doesn't die, and then the potential of a loved one passing away. So, what do you do when you're in that situation, maybe kind of going into it and maybe a loved one is in the hospital now, and you might not be able to see them? I can imagine it to be an intensely scary situation.
Yeah, obviously there's no simple answer to such a difficult situation, except what I would say is, as a physician and having worked a lot in hospitals in the past, is as much as you can, if you can have that difficult conversation. My wife and I were both talking about this, trying to have it with our own parents, is that conversation of what are your wishes, what are your desires, while they're healthy and lucid. Having that conversation, perhaps, talking about advance directives, living wills, those kind of things, where people can be able to decide beforehand, what is it that they want. Do they want to be put on ventilation? How long would you want to be put on ventilation? Even in states where it may not be completely applicable, at least it gives some record of your wishes, and it gives your loved ones what your wishes would be when things are not so intensely scary, and your emotions might get the best of you because they're so high and intense, and guilt can get the best of you, and your own kind of childhood longings of not wanting to let go. Those kind of things, all of that plays a role. So we want to be able to make the decisions when we're at our best. And so by doing that ahead of time can help ease a lot of that kind of stress of like making those decisions, because making decisions, especially if we're not sleeping well, our decision making capacity goes down and down and down if we're not sleeping that great. So you could imagine where your loved one's on a ventilator, and for 5, 6, 7 days, you're probably not going to get that great of sleep. So your decision-making capacity is going to go through the toilet at that particular point. So you want to try to make those as early as possible, have that out and be there as well. And obviously, if you can do that beforehand, great. If not, I would definitely, if you're sleep deprived or something along those lines, you want to reach out to as many people that you can trust as possible. Have people who can help counsel you in that regard, and get the help you want, because it's difficult to be a person, especially if you don't have the kind of expertise about it as well. Knowing the differences, the risks, the factors, and you got different doctors, which you might be in situations where they're not really able to tell you the full kind of risk-benefit ratio that's going on there, and it's a very difficult situation. So as much as you can, get ahead of it. And number two, finding out people ahead of time. Hey, do you mind if we were in a situation, you back me up on this one, and I back you up on this one, and we'll just try to do the best we can, because it's all you can ask for. And I think that would be a great way to start.
There's an aspect to this where it's also a hard conversation to have with some people, whether they're advanced in age or they're at risk. And that conversation might be bringing them to a fear of their own mortality.
Yeah.
How do you be gentle about that?
Yeah, it's excellent question, because I've struggled with this question myself in that respect, because sometimes you may be on like, say you're doing a Zoom talk with one of your parents, and you could tell maybe they're starting to get a little more anxious, and so you probably don't want to do it then. Again, it's trying to find those moments when the things are going well, are going smooth, and maybe you just present it first. Hey, it's an offering. It's like, you don't want to force the person into this conversation, but you want to play, I heard on such and such, I heard on this thing on YouTube or maybe some other place else, that it may be helpful to kind of talk about what we want to do, and talk about it in both directions, because there are times, even with people who are younger, who are obviously being put on ventilators, that's happening enough where it's a good conversation. So it's a shared experience. It's not just aimed at them. So it's like we're both sharing our own vulnerability, that we're all going to die at some time. And so to be able to face that is both difficult, but it could be, surprisingly, it could be a meaningful experience. So again, using that strategy I mentioned before, striking when the iron is cold, when things are well. The thing to watch out on that one is that we don't want to always rock the boat. Oh, things are good with mom and dad right now, let me not bring that up. And that's exactly when you want to. So you may want to just present it as an idea, just test the waters, see what it's like, and they may shut up, and then you may want to just every now and then just test the waters, and eventually maybe their resistance would kind of open up. And I wouldn't do it before bedtime. It's not something you want to call, hey, let's talk about death just before you hit the hay. That doesn't sound like a nice idea, but probably a little bit earlier, probably when people are in a kind of better frame of mind, and that way you can approach it and take it one step at a time. If it gets overwhelming, stop. Again, it's like that same idea we talked about, when the intensity level of a certain emotion goes up. You may want to break away, talk about something else, and then we could always talk about it at another time, but then reconvene and eventually you work through it. But it's not easy, and you understand it's not easy on both sides of the table.
There's another aspect to loss of a loved one that goes back to the pandemic being such a bad situation, and that is the isolation involved. So you may not be able to visit this person in the hospital. You may not be able to hold in-person services if a loved one passes away. Do you have any, I guess, tips for just dealing with how hard that could actually be, above and beyond just what would be a really, really difficult situation in normal times?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you can do when it comes to grief like that, and in such a, I would even put it as a bizarre form of situation where I think there's not really been many situations where you're isolated, where you can't really make connection. Perhaps they're being on a ventilator. Perhaps you're seeing that, and you know it's uncomfortable for them, really uncomfortable for them. It is tragic, and I think it really is in that case is to recognize it is a tragedy, and it's okay. There's tragedies in our lives that we face, and just allow yourself to fully allow yourself to have that experience. The more you can just let yourself have that, and have people, as many people around you that you love and connect as much as possible. Because I don't want to use necessarily the cure of grief, but what grief is meant to do is that when you're grieving and you're really letting go and you're crying, it's one of the purest emotions, and it shows again that you care. You can't really fake real grief, not the kind of just the tears. I mean, just full body uprising. And when people see that, people who are loving and caring, it brings people who are loving and caring together. That's what it was meant to do in drives. That you see the person grieving, it brings everyone together so that you can feel that connection, so that the emptiness, the lost feeling inside is helped by the connection of others, by other people that you connect with. So if you have that opportunity, if you are in proximity and you are living with somebody in which you can have that physical contact with, if possible, if not, then find any way possible where you can see as many of your loved ones' faces, talking about those kind of things and being able to connect on those deeper levels, because it really is a time to connect. Connection is the kind of balancer for grief in that case, and not letting yourself just get lost. There's times when there's sort of contemplation where you just want to be by yourself and just let yourself go. Completely fine and beautiful thing, and allow yourself to connect as much as possible, not trying to isolate, not trying to fall into kind of avoidance patterns where you're going to be maybe excessively drinking, those kind of things. If you did drink one night, fine, just dust yourself off, no biggie, and get out there and start to connect again. That's okay. That we're not meant to be, this is not a perfect thing. It's a very, very, like I said, artificially bizarre, whatever word you want to choose, situation, and it's really, really difficult. And kind of accepting its difficulty, I think, can make it a lot easier, less likely for you to resist it.
Yeah, thanks. There's a piece of this too, for people who may not have lost a loved one, but in anticipation of not being able to be with them. Maybe it's their parents or some other older people in their life, and they live in a different city. Or even if they live in the same city, they want to follow the social distancing guidance and not go and see the person in person. And I think that for some of us has led to some also extra feelings of guilt. Like, am I doing enough for this person who might be alone? Or, you just want to care for this person, but you can't physically be with them. How can we work with that set of feelings?
Exactly. And I think, that's, you hit it really on the head on that one, because, I'm going through that myself. I live in Santa Barbara. My parents live in New Jersey, and that's always a difficult thing when you live so far away. And so, I try to make an effort to try to connect on like mediums like this, and then trying to have really meaningful connections, really talking, not just, one of the things is about that kind of, that tip about connecting people on these mediums is to be careful not to just talk about COVID all the time. It's really the time that, is this an opportunity to really talk about the meaningful expression? It's like if you knew, if you knew your parent was going to die in the next month, what was it that you would want to say most to them? What kind of conversations would you might want to have with them? you know, these are the things you may want to think about. They're not easy thoughts to have, obviously. So, but what is it that you would want to have? You know, what would you want to say? What would you want to do? This is the opportunity to have that kind of conversation with people, to have that deeper, meaningful stuff. And I think that really lends itself on there. And then the guilt itself can kind of, because guilt can easily turn into shame. Guilt meaning feeling like you're doing something bad. Shame being you're identifying with the badness, thinking that you are bad. And shame is more, the problem with shame is that it's like it's a feeling of powerlessness. It's a feeling of wanting to collapse within yourself. So it's less likely to seek out some sort of reparation action, while guilt purely is that you would want to do something to repair it. So thinking with guilt, that guilt, again, going back, I think what we said earlier, guilt is tied in, you wouldn't feel guilty unless you cared. So rather than just focusing on the guilt, you don't have to get rid of it, but just pivot your attention around, that's true. I couldn't feel guilty unless I cared. I actually really care. And also, oftentimes this guilt is coming from the little child in us. If you ask yourself in that moment when you feel guilty, ask yourself, how old do you feel? And if you can just be honest with yourself, you might notice that you feel like this young child who's powerless, who wants to be able to maybe reach out and you know, be with mom or dad or someone else that you may love, and you're not able to do so. So that powerless will activate potentially that child part within you. So what's happening is that guilt is also a part of the childlike insecurity. I'm not sure, am I doing things right? What am I gonna do? All that kind of questioning. So what really needs healing in that moment is also that part of you. Not to be too cliche here, but it's like the inner child kind of thing, but it really is that younger program. And you can ask yourself how old you are. And then because the guilt pivots to care, you give your attention to the care, which then will also help inform you how you would want to interact with them while have the opportunity to do so. It not only does that, but then that care can come back around to the child part of you that's being activated, and giving that your attention. What does it feel like when you're feeling those sensations of guilt in there? And what you'll notice is, for a lot of people, it feels insecure. It's a wobbling. I'm not sure what to do. That kind of thing. It's the younger part of you that's coming on there. So by noticing that you care, and then bringing the care back to that younger part of you, that will help to kind of self-soothe that particular part. And maybe you can ask yourself, what other things does that part of me would want right now? Maybe it's a music, maybe it's something else that's self-soothing and that kind of thing. And then that way we can pivot from guilt into care and allow it to kind of grow and nourish us, to discover more meaning from our interactions with our loved ones, and also to sort of begin the healing process within ourselves.
Yeah, well, it definitely feels, at least for me, if I think about the inner child, I feel a lot kinder to myself once I put it in that framing. Like you forgive a child in some ways, you know, you want to help that child. I think that's really useful.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to, there's a Jordan Peterson it was kind of like something like, treat yourself like someone you care about. Because we generally treat ourselves pretty crappy in that terms, especially our inner critic. So it's a really good rule of thumb to use. I love it. I use it a lot in my practice. I use it myself. It's a good rule of thumb to have. So treat yourself like someone you would care about. And I do use that a lot, like where people especially are condemning themselves so much. I go, how helpful is that strategy when you do that? How helpful is it when you're berating or beating yourself? Does that help you to gain? Do you gain more meaning, and are you able to develop new capacities with that? Or what percentage? I'll even go to what percentage. And some people might say, yeah, 5% helpful. So if it's 5% helpful, well, then and it's 90% hurting you, perhaps we want to examine this whole kind of situation. So you can look at it. Remember, we were talking about before on two levels, both on a cognitive level and looking at it from a sheerly pragmatic strategy level kind of thing of thinking in that terms, and also on more the heart level, the emotional level, and using care and giving attention to those parts and soothing those aspects. So again, using that kind of two-level approach and what calls to you in that moment.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up. Today has felt like a bit heavy, at least maybe just a bit of the topic. Yeah. So maybe to just wrap up, like, if we want to shift into something that would brighten our day, what sort of trick or technique would you give just to feel good?
You know, I mean, there's a lot. The one thing is I have this Happy Grooves playlist. And I have, you know, you can imagine me as a psychiatrist, you know, working with patients, a lot of them suicidal, a lot of them having a lot of deep, you know, just a lot of heavy, as you put it, heavy emotions and that kind of thing. So what I like to do is when I'm done, I put some music on, and yes, I do dance, you know, and I like to move around and dance around. I do it with my wife. We have this sort of like silly hour, or not hour, but like silly like 10, 20, 30 minutes. And if it wants, it could go on to an hour. We'll just do that. We'll just like, just be silly. Let's just, for like 10 to 20 minutes, let's just act like goofballs and let's just let things fly. You know, like, and if we want to go longer, we'll let it go longer. And we just sort of let ourselves just be, it's like letting that kid part in us, since we're regressing anyway, play, like have that fun, have that joy, you know, watching comedies, that kind of thing, you know, those kind of like more lightening the mood and all those kind of things. So I think in that kind of stuff, like allowing yourself to be, I think in this culture, we've gotten way too much into image and looks and trying to look this way and that way and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, I'm thinking about maybe making some videos where I just act like a complete goofball. So if a doctor who might lose his practice in such a way would act like a goofball, and that's such a, but you know what? I think we have to kind of show some modeling and examples of that so that we can allow ourselves to be idiots. Why not, right?
I'm about to just go on the beach and just go completely goofy right now. I feel that need. All right.
This has been super helpful for me, and hopefully can help other people as well stay in good spirits through this hard time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Again, Jim, it's always been a pleasure. And I really, again, find a lot of meaning and a lot of, I just really appreciate this opportunity to try to help out whenever we can.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.